So I'll go as slow as I can, but I'm around the rest of the day, all day tomorrow. So I'm encouraging you to come to the discussion, the consulting room tomorrow with particular questions or to help give me a chance to clear up some confusion if I've generated any for you. So with that, we'll get underway. Chemical fertilizers contain generally fewer elements than organic fertilizers. Of course, kinds of nutrients. They contain greater amounts of nutrients. Fewer kinds, greater amounts. Very concentrated kind of a thing. And they're soluble in general. They go into solution, which is the form that plants have to have them in order to absorb them very quickly. They go into solution relatively quickly. And they do not really support tilth because they leave no residues that promote microbial activity that promotes an increase in soil tilth. Organic fertilizers, so by contrast, then contain more kinds of nutrients but lower amounts of nutrients. And this is a part that's it's easy to forget or easy to get in trouble with anyway. And they're soluble only after decomposition. The microbes will decompose these and release the nutrients over time. And they do leave residues that support the generation of soil tilth or the improvement of soil tilth. Nutrients provided to crops from organic sources now depend on the concentrations of those nutrients in that organic amendment. Of course, there's a great range of different nutrients in organic material, different kinds, and the plants rely on the rate at which those are delivered. It depends on what kind of organic forms they're in. We'll have a little illustration a little bit later about how important that is. The chemical forms that they are in organic matter make all the difference in how quickly they're going to be transformed by the microbes. Depends very much on the amount of oxygen available to the microbes, the temperature in the soil when you apply these, and very importantly, the moisture content. They require all of this in order to decompose organic amendments at a maximum rate. And then, of course, the bottom one there is the very thing. These nutrients are released over some period of time, as opposed to the inorganic fertilizers, which are all fairly much available immediately. The overall thing of what we're looking at here, the scheme of what we're looking at here is organic matter plus microbes. Together, we get a decomposition activity going from that process, if everything goes right, is the release of plant available nutrients. And the rest of it is given off as CO2 in their metabolism, respiration, or whatever is left over continues on decomposition processes much more slowly towards the humification process and the production of humus in the soil. So these are the main directions that organic materials go in once they're in the soil. Okay, two important processes that we've studied for a very long time in the soil in terms of nutrient give and take in the soil: mineralization and immobilization. These have been studied very thoroughly and for a very long time. Mineralization generally is the processes that lead to the release of plant nutrients into the soil. So microbes decompose organic matter to the point where these nutrients, these excess nutrients, are released into the soil. Those are the ones that the plants are able to use. Immobilization is just the opposite. If microbes need these nutrients for their own processes, they will take them away from the environment, tie them up in their own biomass. And we call that process immobilization. If they take them up and remove them from the environment, then plants are unable to use them, right? So they're not in solution anymore. These processes go on all the time in the soil, depending on all these other things. The environment, the quality of the carbon things, we'll talk about that. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, one of the strangest ideas. Very straightforward up front. Carbon to nitrogen ratio, and we could also talk about carbon to phosphorus ratio, carbon and sulfur ratios, or all of those together. But carbon to nitrogen ratio is a concept that tells us the relative amounts of carbon that are present in an organic material compared to the amount of nitrogen in that material. It says nothing at all about how quickly it's broken down. Only the amounts tells us the amounts of each of those. Carbon to nitrogen and MIT thresholds. Okay, what we normally see with organic materials is a rule of thumb here is if we have a carbon to nitrogen ratio greater than 30 to 1, we get at least initial tie-up of extra nitrogen in the soil, making it unavailable to plants, okay? If that ratio is between 20 to 1 to 30 to 1, that's kind of an intermediate kind of an area. There won't be a strong release of nutrients or a strong tie-up of nutrients. And if it's less than 20 to 1, we normally look for a material that is going to release nutrients fairly readily. So now let's see how this all holds together. And these come up to about, give you an idea, in some organic materials. You've got 2%, like a compost, 2% nitrogen. That'll give you a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 20 to 1. So that is kind of a rule of thumb you can use to measure or to estimate and try to keep yourself out of trouble of either strongly immobilizing situation or the problem of having too much nutrient mineralized. That's a problem too. And I just have phosphorus up there as a companion there. So 20 to 1, 201 for phosphorus. I'm concentrating on nitrogen today because that is the nutrient that is most commonly coming up short in organic production systems. Any of these can do that. Any of these organically mediated nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, can be involved in this. But I'm going to concentrate on nitrogen because it's most commonly a problem in organic systems. Okay, carbon quality. Here's the key. There are organic compounds that have very easily metabolized carbon in them. Things like sugars and proteins, some carbohydrates. The microbes can chew these things up really quickly, and I call these things fast carbon. Then there are those that are slower carbon. They're carbon too, but microbes, because of some reasons we'll talk about, it takes them longer to generate the enzymes to break these things down. These are the humus type polymers, lignins, fats, and waxes, the leftovers of the plant parts that are very difficult to decompose because of their chemical structure. So those I like to classify as slow carbon. Okay, some ideas about the amounts of these in various amendments. Chicken manure, 4.5% nitrogen, that works out to about carbon nitrogen rate about 7. So one would expect that to release nutrients because it's less than 20 to 1 pretty quickly. And sure enough it is. Chicken manure is what we call a hot material. It's very active very quickly in the soil. And that's a good thing to remember because you can use that in an emergency to add nitrogen late in the season in an organic system that's kind of lagging in nitrogen. Alfalfa, 15 to 1, oat straw 90, sawdust 225. So what about the release of nutrients from sawdust? Probably a slow process, huh? Okay, so just looking at carbon to nitrogen ratio, we can deduce these kinds of relationships. Okay, mystery organic material has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10. How fast will it decompose? Yeah, yeah, and depending on what it is, that could be true. But humus has a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 10 to 1. So we know that that's extremely slow to decompose. So that's where carbon quality comes in to modify our concept of carbon to nitrogen ratio. Carbon to nitrogen ratios are nice to know, but you've got to know something about the carbon quality in your material as well. That was kind of a trick question. Okay, so our goal to provide nitrogen for crop growth, of course. For most organic substrates with good fertility, 35% of carbon is assimilated by microbes. 65% of it is oxidized away for energy. Remember, microbes are decomposing organic matter for their own use. They don't care about your crop. They want to decompose organic matter for their own use. So of every 100 carbons that they decompose, that they have to generate their energy by oxidizing 65% of those, or 65 carbons, for energy, and they're only able to assimilate 35. So roughly 2 to 1. Okay, that'll come into play a little bit later, but it's important to remember that. And some microbes have higher or lower requirements, you know, but on average, this is kind of what we look at and what we can use in our calculations to figure out how to make these things work. Okay, arithmetic gymnastics here. Let's see, we got 1,000 pounds of oat straw at 0.6% nitrogen, 40% carbon, carbon to nitrogen ratio of 90 to 1. How do we get the 40% carbon? That's not given in any tables. Almost all organic materials are 40% carbon. It can go up or down a little bit, but for our purposes, we can assume no matter what it is, alfalfa meal or sawdust, it's about 40% carbon. That's just how God made them, you know. That's how it works out. So is this 1,000 pounds of oat straw a good fertilizer? It's only 6%. 0.6% nitrogen, carbon nitrogen ratio of 90. That would sort of suggest that we need to look more at the quality of the carbon now, because it's in that range where we can start tying up nutrients. Okay, so we got 1,000 pounds of straw that contains 400 pounds of carbon, right? 40% carbon. Let's see now, 0.6% nitrogen equals 0.6 pounds of nitrogen per every 100 pounds of straw. So we got 1,000 pounds of straw. That gives us 6 pounds of nitrogen in that 1,000 pounds of straw. Okay? Not a whole lot there, is there? So if our goal is to modify this to that intermediate range of 20 to 1 on carbon to nitrogen ratio, this is what we need to do. We need a total, let's see, 400 pounds of carbon times 1 pound of carbon for every 20 pounds, 1 pound of nitrogen for every 20 pounds of carbon, 20 to 1. And I've flipped them over here for mathematical cross product ease. That equals 20 pounds of nitrogen. We need 20 pounds of nitrogen for this 1,000 pounds of straw to reach a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 to 1. Everyone asleep yet? Okay, so we need 20 pounds, but we have only 6. So in order to make this theoretically work out, we need to add 14 pounds of nitrogen to get it into that ballpark. But remember, only 35% of that 400 pounds of carbon is actually assimilated. Remember, because of the efficiency and the fact that microbes need to oxidize and generate energy out of the other 2 out of 3 carbons to become, 35% becomes new microbial bodies or biomass, as we call it. So of the 400 pounds of carbon, only 35% or 140 pounds goes into making new microbe bodies, biomass. Okay? So only 35% of the nitrogen we added is going to be needed by the microbes. So let's see. So we got the rest is available to the crop. 14 pounds times 35%, that's the amount that the microbes are going to get. And it leaves 9.1 pounds for the crop. So just to go back over all this real quickly, 1,000 pounds of straw needs 14 pounds of nitrogen, and it nets 9.1 pounds of nitrogen for the crop. Now, I've left out a number of things in this that modify this number, but I think for the purposes of explaining and showing how we go through these manipulations in order to understand how much am I going to need to do what task in growing this crop so I don't drastically overdo it. I see that a lot. Or drastically underdo it, which I also see a lot. Give you an example real quick of an overdue. Years ago I was at university and got a call from a fellow that owned a organic baby food company. His processor called him and told him, we got a problem. We just checked the nitrate level in beets that we were going to use in baby food. High in nitrogen, high nitrates. Of course, you cannot do that. So he says, these are organic beets. You know, how do they get so high? We didn't use ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate. How did this happen? So I got to quizzing him. He said, well, my growers that had this load rejected, he's been organic for quite a while, but he wanted to increase his yield of beets for this contract. So he added more compost, more chicken manure, and he artificially enriched that soil way past the capacity and what's needed, and ended up in trouble. Beets are a nitrogen accumulator. Most greens are. So this plant saw a lot of nitrogen from this chicken manure, this extra chicken manure and compost, and just took them up, ended up in the beets, got a whole load rejected. Tough lesson, huh? So I thought organic produce didn't have that problem. Not so. We have to be very careful and gauge the amount of nutrients that we provide for organic plants as well as those grown conventionally. We normally attribute those kind of problems to conventionally grown plants in agriculture, but not so. Not so. Okay, sources. We've already had a few of these. Production of nutrients from each of these. Compost has a moderate amount. That means it decomposes at kind of a moderate rate. Most compost that most people use is not really what we call cured compost. It's still in the process of decomposition, so there's still a lot of decomposing going on and nutrients being released and tied up. So it's pretty interesting kind of idea. Poultry manure, very high rate of availability, very high amount of nitrogen, so that can burn crops pretty easily. I've seen that done too. Alfalfa meal, most of the meals are pretty good because they're pretty high in nitrogen and they're kind of moderate to quick acting in soil. They're easier to manage, I think. Ammonium sulfate, just as an example, is an inorganic one, is, well, that it's not, you put it in water and it completely dissolves. So it's very high, and it's 21% nitrogen, so you can burn things with that pretty easily too. Okay. Some work we did a long time ago, and I just put this up here to give you an idea about residual influences. We use compost every year, but it is not all decomposed in year one. A lot of people say that 60% of it is decomposed in year one. That alone tells me it's not cured compost, because compost should not decompose that quickly. It should be more like 20% at most in your, at any rate. That's another issue. So over time, you get smaller amounts of the nutrients out of that, but you do get a residual effect in that in year 2 and 3, you're getting some more nitrogen out of that to feed the year 3 crop. So you have to be cognizant of that. It's normally not very high, depending on what organic matter we're talking about. In compost, it certainly is not very high, but we just have to be aware that that's going to be adding to the nutrition in year 3 and 4. Yes, sir?
For example, it looks like the blood meal, help me understand, decomposes about 90% in the first year. Why is it then 70 and then 50 in year 2 and 3?
Well, that's 70% of the remaining amount.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a crossover addition there. It's not a total amount, but the remaining amount. And that's the same way with all these. You can see by year 4, 5, and 6, there's not a whole lot happening. But there is a little bit anyway. Okay, just some other work I did a while ago. Just look at decomposition rates. Several of these decompose very rapidly. The higher the line, over here, you can hardly see that, the faster the decomposition rate is happening. And of course, these down here at the bottom are soil and bone meal. Bone meal decomposes very slowly, of course. And then we come up to here to these two, I think are kelp, and then up to fish, or bone meal, kelp meal, blood meal, and then fish at the top. So most of the decomposition in these materials, except the bone meal and the soil control, happen very quickly. So you have to be careful how you use those things in the early part of the growing season. Well, so what? You know, who cares? We'll talk about that. Just to let you know that now we're going to talk about plant uptake of nutrients and the requirements for that. There are a lot of data on the web about total nutrients required for growing plants. You know, normally what you see is the total amount that's applied. Fertilizer dealers will say, well, you need 250 pounds of nitrogen for corn in this location. Okay, so you go out and add 250 pounds of nitrogen. You know, some people do that. Let's examine those kind of things. Nutrient uptake requirements for plants are very different. Remember the slope of that other line, of that other graph? Look at the slopes in this one. This is the opposite. Plants don't require very much at the beginning of the year. And yet some people will put 200 pounds of nitrogen out there, terribly inefficient, either organically or inorganically. Conventionally. So over time, about 50 days, the demand starts jumping up. There's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium here, but again, I'm focusing on nitrogen because it's the most problematic. So most of it, or very little of it, is needed before 50 days. It's just going along on its own about that long. So, okay, keeping that shape in mind there, then we can look at some other things. Okay, corn, using organic fertilizers. We want to, another rule of thumb is that a bushel of corn takes a pound of nitrogen. That's not true, but that's another story altogether. But that's the rule of thumb. And we want to get 300 bushel corn here in an organic system. We're ambitious. We're even more ambitious because we want to do this all with compost, which is 2% nitrogen. 2% nitrogen. And we'll use the rate 60% decomposing in year 1, which is extremely generous, I think. We will need, let's see, 300 pounds of nitrogen, what we need, and we know 100 pounds of compost contains 2 pounds of nitrogen. So we need 15,000 pounds of nitrogen to do this. So does everybody make a lot of compost or willing to buy it? But that's not, it gets better. Only 60% of it is decomposed in year one. So of that 15,000 pounds, only 60% is going to be decomposed. So we divide that by 0.6, we get 25,000 pounds of compost needed to grow 300 bushel corn. Very practical, huh? Or we can combine with that compost some other nutrients, some other organic nutrient sources at particular times during the year to meet that demand at that time. I've superimposed on this, this blue line is the data that available for corn uptake needs for nitrogen, the blue line. So what I did here said, well, and we didn't give it anything in the beginning, and at day 30, we've added some compost, a little bit of compost, we're getting some out. We're still less than the demand. So our corn is already hurting. Okay, did I do that again? Sorry. So at later date, we say, oh, my corn is hurting, the leaves are yellowing. So I'm going to come back and put some fish meal on that. And I'm scared I'm going to sock it to it. So you put a bunch of fish meal in there, and without running through these rough calculations, you overdo it. So you've got nutrient in the soil greater than what the corn needs. That's inefficiency at the worst. But then you recover from that, and by day 100 you make up more with using blood meal, and then you overshoot it just a little bit, but you're a lot better off. So you get the idea from this that you can cobble together these other sources of nutrients. I really like the idea of using compost as your baseline fertility. And then as much as you can, using these other quicker reacting materials, fish hydrolysates, blood meal, things like that, fish meal, those kind of things. Feather meal is real good for nitrogen, that respond quicker and can keep you out of trouble. Okay, so let's just get on with the program real early here. At planting, we'll give it a bunch of nitrogen here. Wait a minute, it doesn't need it then. So our zeal has gotten us into trouble again. We're using our resources inefficiently. And at 30 days, same thing. And then, well, we're trying to catch up with it and reduce this, see how things are going, and we're adding all three now, or getting a residual effect of all three, and we've overshot it again, but by 100 days, we're back on track. So it seems like it's very easy to overshoot, undershoot, just a up and down roller coaster until you get the soil to a point where compost can supply an appreciable portion in it. That's the great moderator in all this. And then you can use these other things to tweak it. You can use some Chilean nitrate along the way because it reacts extremely quickly. It's sodium nitrate, go right into the plant uptake system. So there are many things out there to use, and you can cobble these together, apply them at the right time, and do very well. So in summary here, we want to match plant needs at a particular time with available nutrients from organic sources. Combine organic fertility sources to meet nutrients needed, that nutrients required as needed. You need some kind of a gauge to tell you how much you need. You know, you can look at the plants, and with a little practice, you can tell what's wrong with them. Or you can have tissue analysis run, which is the best way. And then that tells you exactly what you need, and you can go right out and remediate that. Compost, as I mentioned, makes the best foundation because of the longevity of it in the soil. And then supplement during the season with high nutrient sources, your fish hydrolyzed fish meals and things like that. But you got to have a goal in mind. You got to be able to do at least some rough calculations in order to get there, to keep your system efficient and environmentally regulated. So that's all I have. I thank you.